Hello, this is Jack Theakston, and it will be my pleasure and privilege to tell you almost everything I can about a landmark film, its history, its people, and most importantly, a series of milestone restorations that saved it from almost being lost. A prestige film of the highest caliber? Welcome to the audio commentary for Ruben Mamoulian's Becky Sharp, starring Miriam Hopkins, the first feature film shot in the new Technicolor. Based on William Makepeace Thackeray's Vanity Fair, published in 1847, Becky Sharp, although not a financial success upon its release, paved the way for future Technicolor productions that would cement the process's reputation in Hollywood, including Gone with the Wind, The Adventures of Robin Hood, and The Wizard of Oz. Not unlike the transitional sepia tone opening of The Wizard of Oz, you'll notice that the opening titles for this film start off with a black and white MPAA logo and RKO logo, and this pale blue background on the title sequence will fade into an equally pale blue curtain, upon which the first splash of color will be seen. This is the line in which black and white officially crosses over to full color in cinema, the point in which the audience, who has struggled with inferior color processes peppered through a black and white world of shadows, can now experience the luxury of seeing on the screen what the eye see in real life. Real, complete, and lifelike color, brought to you by Glorious Technicolor, a name that would be the last word in film color for over 70 years. Color in pictures does not mean that the screen will be deluged in brilliant hues, said Robert Edmund Jones, the art director of this film. Color is rather the tone of the picture, or the underlying harmony of all tones. Every square inch of the picture must be related to every other square inch. And as we enter here, we see, in full Technicolor, the transition has occurred, with a pale blue background being the setting for reds, greens, blues, yellows, purples, every color of the rainbow, all brought to you in this new process that had been previously only little seen.
Farewell, farewell, sweet friend of childhood years. Let sorrow not detain thee, nor our tears.
And like any great film, even with color or in black and white, you have to have a great star behind it. And here's Becky Sharp, played by our star, Miriam Hopkins. Born in Savannah, Georgia in 1902, Miriam's early years were plagued with bad luck, between her parents' divorce in 1909 and a chronic heart condition that would haunt her for her entire life. Despite her lifelong Southern belle persona, Hopkins and her family moved to New York when she was a teenager. After a rocky start on the stage in 1920, the following year she landed a dancing part in Irving Berlin's Music Box Revue, a well-received show, and continued to act on the stage regularly throughout the 1920s. After the transition to sound and motion pictures, producer Walter Wanger scouted her after seeing Hopkins in a production of Lysistrata in 1930 and signed her to Paramount Pictures. She made her first picture, Fast and Loose, that year, followed by The Smiling Lieutenant, directed by Ernest Lubitsch, for whom she would work with again in 1932's Trouble in Paradise and 1933's Design for Living. Hopkins' bad girl persona, in contrast to her virginal platinum blonde looks, landed her juicier roles after the success of The Smiling Lieutenant. In 1931, she co-starred opposite Frederick March in arguably her best-remembered performance as Ivy Pearson in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a film that was plagued by censors. 2 years later, she starred as the eponymous character in The Story of Temple Drake, a film that is considered to be possibly one of the raciest films of the pre-code motion picture era. Prior to working on Becky Sharp, Miriam co-starred with the Paramount leading man Joel McCrea, an actor she would work with in 5 films during her career. Hopkins' screen career continued in the 30s and 40s with prestige parts in such films as Barbary Coast and The Heiress, although in 1939 she lost what would have been her biggest role as Scarlett O'Hara in David O. Selznick's Gone with the Wind to Vivien Leigh. By the early 1940s, with her age catching up with her, Miriam went back to work on the stage, where she continued a successful character lead career. With the popularity of television in the 1950s, Hopkins continued her acting on the small screen in many live televised dramas and film shows into the 1960s. Her last screen appearance was in 1970 in the Whatever Happened to Baby Jane-inspired Savage Intruder, opposite Gail Sondergaard. Just 9 days short of her 70th birthday, Miriam Hopkins died of a heart attack in her home in New York.
Mercy, wasn't it a joy teaching me younger girls music and French? And no...
She's the perfect embodiment of Becky Sharp in this picture.
Goodbye, then. Oh, this dictionary for you.
Miss Pinkerton, Mr. Joseph Sedley, ma'am.
Enter, sir.
Sedley is played by one of my all-time favorites, Nigel Bruce. If he's the embodiment of aristocracy in this film, it's because the role was not far off from the mark. His family, descended from Robert the Bruce, settled in Baja, Mexico, where he was born in 1895. Bruce was educated in England, and after a brief turn as a stockbroker, enlisted in the British Army during World War I in 1914. The following year, Bruce was shot in the leg and was given an honorable discharge. In 1919, he started his career on the stage in both London and New York, making a name for himself in primarily comedy roles. In 1930, he made his debut in films in The Squeaker, a British film based on the story and play by Edgar Wallace. In the early 1930s, Bruce continued to perform on stage and screen in England, and in 1934 was featured in his first American film for Fox, Coming Out Party, which also starred Becky Sharp players Frances D. and Alison Skipworth. A big breakout role for Bruce was 1934's Springtime for Henry, based on the Ben W. Levy play that Bruce starred in on Broadway for its run between December 1931 and May of 1932. This and prestige roles in Treasure Island and The Scarlet Pimpernel launched Bruce into a character lead career that continued into the late 30s, when in 1939 he landed the role he will ever be known for, Dr. Watson, to Basil Rathbone's Sherlock Holmes in The Hound of the Baskervilles for Fox. The duo would make 14 films in the series, the first 2 at Fox, the remainder at Universal. He was also featured in Rebecca and Suspicion for Alfred Hitchcock, and, like Becky Sharp, appeared in another technical first, 1952's Buona Devil, the first American color 3D feature directed by Arch Obler. His last film, released posthumously in 1954, was The World for Ransom, directed by Robert Aldrich. Ill for some time, Bruce died of a heart attack at his home in Santa Monica in 1953. If you notice, many of the close-up shots have a short depth of field. That was due to the great amount of light that was necessary to light Technicolor films, and we'll be discussing how those films were shot in a moment.
Oh, I shall press this one, too. I've kept all of your dear flowers.
Becky, I don't know what to say to you. By Jove, dare I call you my...
Your what, Joseph?
my bird? Or something similar?
I wonder if young Osmond in there is calling Amelia.
Contrasting colors are used throughout the film in costume work. Becky's dress here is a bright yellow, peppered with startling blue bows and dots and patterns. Sedley has a mostly...
Do not hesitate to express their emotions.
And I offer you my heart, my true affection. I offer you love, Amelia, and a lifetime of...
Playing the part of Becky's faithful friend Amelia is Frances D. Born in Los Angeles, California in 1909, Dee's family moved to Chicago when she was 7. In 1929, while visiting her family back in Los Angeles, Frances started her film career as an extra at Paramount Pictures, until she was discovered by Paramount star Maurice Chevalier in The Studio Commissary, landing her first starring role in 1930's Playboy of Paris, opposite Chevalier. Landing a contract with Paramount, Dee starred in many very leading roles throughout the 1930s, including 1931's An American Tragedy and Working Girls, 1932's This Reckless Age and The Night of June 13th, 1933's Little Women and Headline Shooter, and 1934's Of Human Bondage and Finishing School. In 1933, on the set of The Silver Cord, Dee met co-star Joel McCrea, whom she married later that year and would appear in such films as 1937's Wells Fargo and 1948's Four Faces West. Like her co-star in this film, Dee was considered for a role in Gone with the Wind as Melanie Wilkes, but turned it down. Her most memorable role was in 1943's I Walked with a Zombie, directed by Jacques Tourneur. After a string of films in the 1940s and 50s, followed by some early television appearances, Dee retired from the screen to live on her ranch with McCrea in Thousand Oaks, California. Following McCrea's death in 1990, Dee passed away in 2004. Amelia's suitors were Colin Tapley as William and G.P. Huntley as George. You've seen Huntley as majors and lieutenants in films like Charge of the Light Brigade and They Died with Their Boots On. Tapley, a New Zealand native, was a stalwart character actor. His biggest role was starring in the 1938 jungle picture Baloo. Although widely publicized as the first color feature, Becky Sharp's distinction in history is actually as the first completely three-color Technicolor feature. Color photography in motion pictures began as early as the history of movies themselves. Early Edison and Lumiere films were painstakingly hand-colored using dyes painted onto black and white prints for an effect that can be best likened to colored postcards from the period. Likewise, a general color could be applied to the complete picture in the form of running the processed black and white film through a dye bath. This method, called tinting, would give an overall image one color to emphasize a mood of a scene, and was ubiquitous during the silent and early talkie film era. Night scenes would be blue, day scenes would be amber-colored or yellow, and fire scenes would be red.
The government needs men of courage.
The complement to this was toning, in which silver particles were replaced with dyes. So sepia toning, for example, gives the impression of brown and white rather than black and white. Iron toning gives the film an impression of blue and white. Occasionally, ambitious labs combine tinting and toning in a pleasing combination, such as blue toning and pink tinting. Natural color photography, however, was an idea that many technicians took decades to solve. The full spectrum of color can be broken down into three major wavelengths: red, green, and blue light. If you look closely at the individual scan lines or pixels on your TV screen, you'll notice that they're in fact a small series of red, green, and blue light dots. All three at full brilliance will synthesize white light, while combinations of the two of them will create other colors. For example, when you see yellow on your screen, it's actually a combination of small red and green lights mixed together. These dots are so small that your eyes cannot detect them individually from a distance, and thus color is replicated. Experimentation in natural color photography is credited to the British technician Edward Turner, who patented what is called successive exposure photography in 1899. Turner discovered that if you photograph each successive frame through red, green, and blue color filters, and then in projection through the same type filters, if projected fast enough, a flickery but full color image could be obtained. Turner died in 1903, but his financier, producer Charles Urban, turned to inventor and pioneer George Albert Smith to continue this research. Smith found that recording all three colors resulted in an image that was far too flickery even at the fastest speed one could crank a projector, and eliminated the blue record altogether, reducing the colors to be recorded as red and blue-green. Although this would result in a limited palette, it made the flicker less noticeable, and skin tones remained consistent. Urban and Smith debuted this process commercially as Kinemacolor, which continued to produce and distribute films for the next 8 years, making it the film's first successful color process. Other processes were developed throughout the 1910s, most of them copies of Kinemacolor, but the first game changer for the improvement of natural color came in 1916, when Eastman Kodak introduced duplitize stock. This type of film carries two emulsions, one on either side of the base. In doing this, printing two color records onto the stock is possible, and beginning around this time, companies such as William Kelly's Prisma began printing two color records onto this film, and then toning them red on one side and blue-green on the other, thereby removing the need for color filters and eliminating projection flicker altogether. George Hassel is the one playing Sir Pitt here. Born in Birmingham, England in 1881, he had a distinguished career on stage before turning to a brief film career in the 1930s. His previous film to this was Night Life of the Gods, directed by Lowell Sherman. More on him later. Although his sequence in this film is brief, it's memorable and downright Dickensian. Hassel, whose name is also misspelled in the credits, died in 1937. Handsome Captain Crawley is portrayed by Alan Mowbray, who, if you've even seen a handful of films from the 1930s or 40s, you'll recognize. Mowbray was born Ernest Allen in London in 1896, and after serving in the British Army in World War I, turned to acting in London's West End. He came to the U.S. as part of a tour with the Theatre Guild in 1923. Although successful in a touring capacity, Mowbray never made it big on Broadway, and his own play, 1929's Dinner is Served, was a resounding flop.
Would you like me to read you a pretty story? No.
In 1931, he turned his sights to Hollywood, where he started his career as a butler in God's Gift to Women. By the end of the year, however, he had garnered some critical praise in roles such as his portrayal of President George Washington in Alexander Hamilton with George Arliss. Further parts in Arliss's films such as Voltaire and House of Rothschild established him as a consistent British character actor. Credits after Becky Sharp include My Man Godfrey, On the Avenue, and the first two Topper films, I Wake Up Screaming, and The Man Who Knew Too Much. He died in 1969. Pitt Crawley is played by William Stack. Not much is known about his pre-film career, and despite his impeccable British accent, he was known to be born in Oregon. Surprisingly, with such a meaty part as this is probably his biggest role. Most of his career was character bit parts. This would be a good time to point out some of the color choices and costuming in this film. For the most part, you'll notice most of the sets are in neutral tones, with subtle hits of color in just the right places. For example, in this master shot, the only background color are some subtle roses to the left and blue moonlight outside the balcony. Becky mostly wears striking yellow when she's wealthy and blue when she's poor. These costumes are usually accented by light blue. Once married to Crawley, her virginal white negligees are an ironic touch to Becky's flirtatious habits in the story. Amelia usually wears pure colors in this film, including blue, white, and lavender. Captain Crawley dons primary colors of yellow and blue with a striking red army coat. Pitt Crawley is often clad in navy blue and black and dresses like a minister, and an aristocrat, Stain wears black with a satin-lined cape. The bumbling Sedley wears earth tones and green, reflecting on his jovial demeanor.
Becky? Becky Sharp? Can't you hear me?
Here comes a tour de force performance in this film. Miss Crawley is played by Alison Skipworth, star of the stage and screen in both England and America. Born Alison Groom in London in 1863, she was a beauty in her youth and modeled in her early years. She married artist Frank Markham Skipworth in 1882, to whom she modeled for, and in 1894, at the age of 31, made her first stage appearance in London. She soon became made part of Daniel Frohman's company and appeared on stage on both sides of the pond. After a string of failed Broadway shows in the 1920s, Skipworth went out to Hollywood during the great mass exodus of Broadway stars during the talkie transition in 1930, and found her success in roles playing ladies, duchesses, countesses, and socialites. She's probably best remembered today as W.C. Field's partner in the segment entitled Road Hogs from the 1932 Paramount anthology film If I Had a Million. Her last film was the starring role in the 1939 Republic picture Ladies in Distress. In 1942, she retired from the stage and screen, and 10 years later, passed away in New York. Kodak was not the only one looking to solve the color challenge, however. In 1912, recent MIT graduates Herbert T. Kalmus and Daniel Comstock joined forces with technician W. Burton Westcott and would spend the next few years trying to develop their own system for color photography. In 1915, the team formed Technicolor Incorporated, and the basis for which color film would be perfected began its arduous route. Westcott's original idea was put into practice, and by the following year, the first Technicolor camera was built. Crude by today's standards, the camera nevertheless achieved the company's first goal of flickerless color projection. Instead of photographing the color records sequentially, a film ran through the camera at double speed. A prism broke the initial image onto two frames, in front of which the light passed through red and green filters. The resulting black and white print was then projected through a similar lens and prism system through two filters, and then aligned onto screen. The system worked in theory, but the company's first film in 1917, The Gulf Between, was a disaster. The system took massive amounts of light to film and even more to project. Not only this, but each theater that would run the film would have to install all new projectors and have a technician on site to align the two images properly. The film also had to be run at double speed. This was a risky proposition given that the film could break much more easily at those speeds and start a fire with the inflammable celluloid the film was printed on. Kalmus went back to the drawing board. Technicolor's camera wasn't the problem, so the company kept the production end of things the same. It was clear that Kalmus and the company had to deliver a print that had not just the color information on it, but the actual color on it. The solution, precarious as it was similar to the duplicitized stock that Kodak had been manufacturing. Print each color record on a separate strip of film, tone them the appropriate red or green colors, and then cement the bases together to form a manageable and projectable color image. Crude and with a few technical drawbacks, Technicolor proved that the company could not only film, but produce and print color images that would be sent to any theater when in 1922 they produced the company's second feature, Toll of the Sea, starring Anna May Wong. The success of this film captured the attention of Jesse Lasky at Paramount, and a contract was signed, and Technicolor became the leading name in color in Hollywood. Over the next several years, Technicolor was used in both full-length format for features and shorts, or peppered otherwise black and white films for sequences of prestige. Paramount produced Technicolor's third full-color feature, Wanderers of the Wasteland, in 1923, and Cecil B. DeMille used the process for scenes in The Ten Commandments later that year. Universal saw the advantage of color, and Technicolor shot key sequences for 1925's The Phantom of the Opera. That same year, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer used the company for several key scenes in their version of Ben-Hur. While Technicolor had studios convinced, exhibitors were not. Technicolor's sandwich-type prints had a number of problems. They were difficult to splice should the film break. Even worse, the cement holding the film together had a tendency to make the film prints buckle and come apart. Technicolor was working around the clock to fix damaged release prints that were being returned from film exchanges. Kalmus's company began researching and developing a new method. Dye transfer printing was a process that had been around as far back as the 1880s, when the French inventor Charles Cros invented a technique in which film that was exposed to a negative could be hardened in the blank areas and used to transfer dye to a paper or glass surface. Kalmus and his technicians took this idea a step further. Exposing the color record negatives to a specially treated black and white film stock and then run through a tanner, areas that were black would harden and areas that were white would stay soft. After washing this film through chemicals, the soft areas would wash away, leaving a relief much like a rubber stamp. When soaked in the appropriate dyes, running these matrices onto a blank piece of film would stamp the red and green records and mix the image onto one surface of film. Kalmus test ran this process for Douglas Fairbanks' The Black Pirate in 1926, and despite some setbacks, began using it for printing exclusively starting in 1928, when Technicolor was married to a soundtrack for the first time in MGM's The Viking. The end of the Roaring Twenties was good for the company. With almost all of the major studios signed with Technicolor, the process became part of the tagline of the new sound revolution in film. All talking, all singing, all Technicolor became the regular tagline. A string of successful Technicolor musicals flooded the market in 1929, including Warner Brothers' The Gold Diggers of Broadway, which grossed over $3.5 million domestically on a budget of little over $500,000. And while Warner Brothers First National used the process most aggressively, Paramount, Universal, Goldwyn, RKO, and MGM used the process for sequences or in their entirety. 1930 started to see the decline of Technicolor's glory, however. The Depression started to take effect, and Technicolor's technical limitations were starting to show. Dailies and one-off prints were crisp and clear, but major runs for the film began to plague Technicolor. At a time in which the average domestic print run of a film was about 200 to 250 prints, Technicolor sacrificed quality for quantity. Smeary color, registration errors, and blurry image plagued productions in 1930 and 31, and did not go unnoticed by reviewers at the time. Kalmus set his technical crew to overseeing solutions for these issues. Better mordants, the chemicals that set the dyes once they hit the receiving film, were introduced. Technicolor's pin belt registration system for aligning the matrix and print film were overhauled. Kalmus was not going to let his multi-million-dollar studio contract slip between his hands. 1931 was Technicolor's leanest year. Aside from cartoon work and short subjects, the only features photographed that year were RKO's Fannie Foley herself and The Runaround, and Warner Brothers' Manhattan Parade. Sales were estimated to be about $500,000, with a deficit of almost $250,000. Even Warner Brothers, who had been supportive of the company since their success with The Gold Diggers of Broadway, started to eschew the company. In 1932, the studio started dumping Technicolor onto less important projects for the studio, most famously that year's Dr. X, a horror film starring Lionel Atwill and Fay Wray. Much to Technicolor's annoyance, the studio filmed the picture twice, once with Technicolor's camera and once in black and white as what they deemed insurance. To add insult to injury, the studio backed out of a full run of prints for the film in color and instead gave exhibitors their choice of the film in Technicolor or black and white. In just a couple of minutes, we're going to see the color quality flatten out a little bit, so keep your eye out for it. I'll speak about the sale of this film later, but the reason for the jump in quality goes back to 1943, when Pioneer Pictures sold this film to the company Film Classics, a studio that specialized in reissues and non-theatrical bookings of films. Instead of having Technicolor reprint the film, the company sent the film to Cinecolor, a lab that specialized in a two-color process that was normally photographed by shooting two strips of film in the camera at the same time, one recording blue-green light and one recording red light. Once processed, the negatives would be sandwiched onto Kodak's duplicitized stock and printed. Then, each side of the stock was toned using a large float tank with toners. One side would be toned red, and the other side would be toned blue-green. The end result when projected through both sides would be a color image. Because Cinecolor's limited color spectrum was suitable for the lower budget productions mostly associated with the process, and because of its cost effectiveness, for a time, Cinecolor was the leading competitor to Technicolor. In doing this, Film Classics re-edited the film from its 84-minute original version to 66 minutes. And since they only needed two color records to print the film, some color records were lost over the years. By the time the film changed hands enough that it hit a television distributor in 1958, the film essentially only existed in black and white. This shot is a great example of not only color composition, but just composition in general. You have the nice two yellow candles to each side of the ladies, and of course you have very delicate tones, a salmon pink on Amelia's dress, and cream with red piping on Becky's.
That's the past. Oh, Becky, you're the most generous, most forgiving, darling.
At this point, you'll notice the color has changed. Becky's blonde hair is now a pale cream color, and the blue fringe on uniforms has turned almost black. This is because we are in reel 4, the first reel in the film to have one of its color records lost. What we're seeing is a recreation of the surviving color from the red and green negatives, essentially a two-color version of what was once three-color. The blue negative for this reel is unfortunately lost. After film restoration became a stable and legitimate business, it was author and historian Ronald Haver who suggested that this film be a candidate for restoration. Haver, who had produced several high-profile screenings of Technicolor films in the 1970s at the LA County Museum of Art, was frustrated when he found out that absolutely no Technicolor prints of the first full Technicolor feature seemingly survived. Haver's first step in trying to get the film restored was to pursue the American Film Institute, but the organization did not have the money to fund such work. He then discovered that the then current distributor of the film, the National Television Association, or NTA, had deposited the film's elements at the UCLA Film and Television Archive. UCLA's preservation officer, Robert Gitt, took note and enlisted YCM Labs' Richard Dayton to start work on what would be one of the archive's longest-running restorations. When UCLA and YCM started the project of resurrecting Becky Sharp, it was apparent that more sources needed to be utilized. In association with the AFI, a worldwide sweep for elements began. Fragments and clips, made essentially useless by their superimposed subtitles, survived at the Bois d'Arcy archive in France. A cut and warm 35mm Cinecolor print was discovered at the British National Film Archive. A 35mm Technicolor print was located at the Cineteca Nazionale in Rome, Italy, but upon inspection, it was found mostly to be useless, glued together by poor tape splices. Among the NTA materials donated to UCLA, the following materials existed. The full feature originally ran 9 reels. Since Cinecolor didn't use the blue negative for their prints, it existed in full, with the exception of reels 4 and 9, which were either lost or deteriorated. The red negative was complete, but cut into the 66-minute reissue version. The green negative was the worst condition of all, also cut to the reissue length, and suffering from deterioration between reels 4 through 9. As was typical with black and white as well as Technicolor productions, safety positives were made from the camera negative as insurance against damage should it be incurred at the lab. These turned out to be somewhat invaluable as well with the restoration process. Other elements included a black and white 16mm television negative made in 1958 from the green negative, which was edited into the 66-minute version, a black and white positive 16mm print made from this negative, a Cinecolor print of the 84-minute version, and the original 3-color Reel 1 that was held at Technicolor for timing purposes. For Reel 9, the final reel, the only element that existed was the red negative. Using the Italian print that was once labeled as unusable, as well as the 16mm Cinecolor print, this reel was reconstructed. Although she only appears briefly in this scene in the film, Billie Burke gets 4th billing in the film. Star of stage and screen, and at this point the widow of the late stage impresario Florence Ziegfeld, she's best remembered today as Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, in 1939's The Wizard of Oz. Undoubtedly, she had a great manager to get such billing in this film. GIT and UCLA started with the soundtrack. Between all the sources at their disposal, the entire film was there. All of this was transferred to magnetic film with the usual equalization techniques used in sound restoration from that period. In the analog days, pops and ticks on tracks were removed by physically scraping the oxide off the magnetic film. This was mixed to 1/4-inch tape, which was then re-recorded onto a 35mm optical track negative. For the picture, many experiments were made using the original elements, and it was decided that staying as close to the original negative was the way to go. Contact printing onto the Eastman color stock was the method chosen by Git, Dayton, and his crew. Whereas Technicolor used optical printers for all their records, contact printing meant a more even contrast for all 3 records, although the red record, printed positive as cyan, would suffer the most because it was printed through the base. Tests were made for every shot at YCM. Pete Comandini of YCM oversaw the color timing for each of the shots, and by the end of 1984, a complete print and preservation negative were finished.
Although we have a similar game in India, except we play it with 1 ball.
As we're watching this, you'll see, since we're in still 2-color mode, a sort of what the Cinecolor version of the film would look like. As I mentioned previously, Cinecolor used red and cyan toners, and this is pretty much the look that they went for in this film. But the drawbacks, of course, when you lose one record, especially in this case, the blue record, which is missing. So you get good flesh tones and good blues and good reds, but you'll never have pure greens, purples, yellows, that sort of thing. And when we'll cut back to the full 3-color elements, you'll see that all the costumes really suffer for it in this version. But if you were just watching this as a Cinecolor print, the color design still comes through quite well. I'm always impressed with how subtle some of these color choices are, even in their compromised form.
George is either dancing with her or losing at cards to her husband.
And I would say even in black and white, if you look at minus the color is of course the most important part of this film, but if you watched this film in black and white, you'd get the impression that it was lit for black and white. It really has real high key lighting that's very typical of the studio photography at the era of the era. The backgrounds tend to be darker or less pronounced, and people in the foreground are very highly lit with great definition. Portraying the Marquis de Steyne is veteran character actor Sir Cedric Hardwicke. Born in Lye, England in 1893, Hardwicke studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and began his career on the London stage in 1912. 2 years later, he enlisted as part of the British Army during World War I and served as an officer until 1921, when his battalion was one of the last to leave France. Returning to the stage in 1922, Hardwicke became a favorite of the playwright George Bernard Shaw and was featured in the original productions of Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra, The Apple Cart, Pygmalion, and Don Juan in Hell. Although he appeared in 2 silent films, namely 1913's Riches and Rogues and 1926's Nelson, it wasn't until 1931 that Hardwicke began his screen career in earnest, debuting in The Dreyfus Case for British International Pictures. A string of British film successes followed, including 3 films with Conrad Veidt, namely Rome Express, Power, and Belladonna. He also starred in The Ghoul with Boris Karloff and Nell Gwyn with Anna Nagel. In 1934, he was knighted by King Charles V for his work on the stage. His first American picture was in 1935's Les Miserables for Fox as Bishop Bienvenu. Becky Sharp marks his second appearance in Hollywood. After a brief return to England studios, where the following year he appeared in Things to Come, he returned to Hollywood for good to star in dozens of classic films, including On Borrowed Time, Stanley and Livingstone, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Suspicion, The Ghost of Frankenstein, I Remember Mama, Rope, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, War of the Worlds, and The Ten Commandments. Hardwicke was also featured in episodes of several high-profile TV shows such as Climax, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, The Twilight Zone, and The Outer Limits. His final film was The Pumpkin Eater in 1964, the year he passed away in New York after a long struggle with emphysema. At this point, we're back to full 3-strip Technicolor, and the costumes and settings really show for it. William Makepeace Thackeray was born in Calcutta in 1811. His father, who was a secretary to the Board of Revenue in the East India Company, died when he was 4, and Thackeray was sent to boarding school in England the following year. On the trip to England, Thackeray saw St. Helena, where Napoleon was serving his exile after the Revolution, and the youngster became fascinated with the character. In England, Thackeray struggled with academics, but nevertheless graduated from Trinity College in Cambridge in 1829. When he was 21, he inherited what was left of his father's estate, which he squandered throughout his 20s. After struggling for some years as an author, he eventually landed work in Fraser's magazine, for which he won much acclaim with his wit. It was in this publication in which he published Catherine and the Luck of Barry Lyndon. Between 1846 and 1847, he published the Snob Papers in the magazine Punch. These satirical essays were quite popular and laid the groundwork for Vanity Fair, which was serialized in the same magazine between January 1847 and July 1848. The phenomenal success of the story, which was then printed in bound form that same year, launched Thackeray into an entirely different echelon of authors, and was followed up by his equally popular Pendennis. Other works by the author include The History of Henry Esmond, The Newcomes, The Virginians, and The Adventures of Philip. Thackeray died in London at age 52 in December 1863. Like many popular novels of the 19th century, Vanity Fair soon became adapted as a stage play in 1899 by Langdon Mitchell, one of Broadway's most popular playwrights of the turn of the 20th century. Opening in September 1899 at the Fifth Avenue Theater, Becky Sharp, the first time the character whose name was used in reference to the adaptation, opened with Minnie Maddern Fisk, known on stage simply as Mrs. Fisk, as Becky Sharp. The play was quite successful, leading to numerous tours and revivals, several of which Fisk revived her famous role in. And, like many great stage adaptations of famous novels, Mamoulian's Becky Sharp was not the first version of the story to be shown on the screen. Perhaps the first screen adaptation of Vanity Fair was the three-reel version filmed for the Vitagraph Company of America in 1911. This digest version of the novel starred Helen Gardner as Becky Sharp, Rose Tapley as Amelia, William V. Rannis as Lord Stane, comedian John Bunny as Joseph Sedley, and Harry Northrop as Captain Crawley. Despite the poor survival rate of many films from this period, this version of the film has survived. In 1915, the Thomas Edison Film Company shot their own version of Vanity Fair, starring a young Shirley Mason as the adolescent Becky, and Minnie Madden Fisk reviving her stage role as the adult Becky. They were supported by Helen Fulton as Amelia, William Wadsworth as Sedley, and Bigelow Cooper as Captain Crawley. A British 1922 version by Master Films, directed by W. Courtney Rowden, included Clive Brooke as Crawley, but the following year, the first feature-length adaptation of the story was distributed by Goldwyn Pictures. This 8-reel version was directed by Hugo Ballin and starred his wife, Mabel Ballin, as Becky Sharp, with Hobart Bosworth as Stane, George Walsh as Crawley, and Eleanor Boardman as Amelia. In 1932, the first sound adaptation of Vanity Fair was produced and directed by Chester M. Franklin. Despite a modest budget, this version featured a pre-Thin Man Myrna Loy as Becky Sharp, Conway Turle as Crawley, Barbara Kent as Amelia, and Montague Love as Stane. As we watch the folks flee from the party here, you'll see it jumps back and forth between 3-strip Technicolor and the ersatz 2-color recreation. Most of this is just due to the editing of the red and green negatives by Film Classics for the 1943 reissue. 1932 was also a landmark year for Technicolor and started off rocky for Kalmus's company. Technicolor was losing studio interest and losing money. The public's waning interest in all-color musicals, combined with the Depression and the initial poor quality print runs, caused a bubble of musicals that had flooded the market to burst. Fortunately for the company, Kalmus's next move proved to be the one that saved Technicolor. With the dye transfer process more or less perfected, it was now time to test the limitations of the company's color spectrum. Technicolor had severely overhauled the way the company would photograph films. Unlike previously, where they had shot a single strip negative, the new camera they designed would roll 3 strips of film at once. Using a beam splitter, one half of the light would travel straight through to the focal plane behind the lens as normal. This would be photographed through a green filter, making 1/3 of the record. The remaining 50% of the light would hit at a right angle in the prism, reflecting onto 2 strips of film that ran through the second gate face to face. In front of these 2 strips was a magenta filter, effectively allowing only red and blue light through to these 2 strips. The first strip was strictly blue sensitive and only recorded blue light. And on the surface of the emulsion of this blue sensitive strip, a light red dye coating acted as a secondary filter, allowing only red light through to the second strip of film behind it, and thus only recording red light on that strip. The 3 strips of film running through the gate in this miraculous process were able to capture, separately, red, green, and blue light on different strips of film. Doing this meant that more than 3 times as much light needed for black and white photography was called for on set. The dye transfer system was kept, although instead of 2 matrices printing red and green, the complementary dyes to red, green, and blue, namely cyan, magenta, and yellow, were applied to the blank receiver stock with the optical soundtrack already printed on it in 3 passes. The first company to take advantage of Technicolor's new system was the Walt Disney Corporation, who signed an exclusive contract to the new use of process strictly for animation. Disney's first film in the new Technicolor, Flowers and Trees, debuted in the summer of 1932 and was exactly the sort of demonstration film Kalmus needed to sell the viability of the new process. Disney continued to use the 3-strip cameras for animation under the banner of Silly Symphonies. Kalmus continued to test out the new 3-color process in a limited run with industrial films, but the backlog of theatrical shorts and features continued to be 2-color. That same year, Kalmus met John Hay Whitney, known by his friends as Jock, the young business mogul at the Saratoga Springs racetrack. There, Kalmus told the millionaire about his company, disclosing that he had the means to not only photograph, but print these pictures. In another meeting, RKO studio head Marion C. Cooper convinced Whitney to get involved. In May 1933, Herbert Kalmus and the Whitneys, newly formed Pioneer Pictures Corporation, signed into a contract for use of the three-color process. Whitney partnered with his cousin, Cornelius Vanderbilt Whitney, to form Pioneer, and the two made ties with producer Marion C. Cooper of RKO to be the distribution arm of these films. As part of the deal, Whitney also purchased 15% of Technicolor stock, undoubtedly to float some much-needed capital into the company's bank account. Fortune magazine estimated at the time that if Whitney had bought 100,000 shares of the company, Technicolor would have risen from its then $13 a share to $20. During the fall of 1933, RKO Studios was the testing ground for Whitney and the Technicolor camera. Pioneer and RKO both turned to the theater, that is, the very theaters they owned. They turned to the art director for RKO's Radio City Music Hall. Robert Edmond Jones is now considered the grandfather of stagecraft. Whereas up until the mid-1910s, most sets were painted backdrops, flats, and realistic construction, Jones emphasized the borderline between the impressionistic and expressionistic. His sets were simple, focusing more on light, scale, and more importantly, color. Jones was born in Milton, New Hampshire in 1887 and attended Harvard University as an art student, where he graduated in 1910. Originally a violinist in the orchestra of the Harvard Dramatic Club, it was not until the following year that he studied costume design as a graduate student. After a brief stay in New York, Jones traveled to Europe, where he studied under Edward Gordon Craig in Florence and Max Reinhardt in Berlin. Returning in 1915, Jones' breakout career move in set design was for The Man Who Married a Dumb Wife, the Anatole France play produced by Granville Barker for Broadway. During the 20s, Jones authored a number of books about stagecraft and set design, and became known as something of an authority on the subject, leading to a lucrative career as a consultant on the subject and ultimately a scenic producer. Whitney knew that Jones' taste and name was enough to sell the picture on an artistic level, and hired the art director at a reported $1,000 a week. During the first half of 1934, Warner Brothers, MGM, Paramount, and Goldwyn began testing the new Technicolor. In all of these instances, the tests were either shorts or inserts and features. Pioneer smartly dipped their toes into the Technicolor pool with a two-reeler. RKO producer Kenneth McGowan oversaw the production, having been a producer at the new studio for a few years. Jones must have been delighted, as he, coincidentally, had worked with McGowan as business partners for years on the stage, and the two had written several books together. Director and sometimes actor Lloyd Corrigan was brought aboard to write and direct the two-reeler. The lawyer for Pioneer Pictures, Mrs. Carolyn Bummeler Wharton, reportedly did much of the set dressing. Technicolor sent their cameraman, Ray Renahan, for maximum effect in photography. At a time when the average short subject for the same length from that period cost about $15,000, and with a budget of about $65,000 and 82,000 feet of film, the final project, La Cucaracha, was produced within a month in June 1934. RKO spared no expense in promoting the short, and despite the film being a two-reeler, promoted it with a luxurious trailer and Technicolor. On July 12th, Whitney trade-screened the short in the cert room of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel at 3 showings. The reception was promising. With Technicolor's print run completed, RKO premiered La Cucaracha at Radio City Music Hall in New York on August 30th, 1934, supporting the feature attraction of Anne Harding and Brian Ahern in The Fountain. Reviews and reception were a triumph. Variety's Abel praised the film. Quote, "Perfection of the Technicolor process is emphasized by the complete lack of blur by which previous attempts have too frequently been marred. The clearness under the Whitney process is such as to stamp the first of his productions as a fitting contribution to the cinema art. Particularly are the close-ups superbly done, so much that perspiration and even the pores of the face are brought out through under a microscope. It's a fine piece of work and reflects credit on Robert Edmond Jones for his art direction and Ray Renahan, whose Technicolor camera work is flawless." As one exhibitor wrote, quote, "The short subject will draw them in, even if the feature won't." This was the sort of publicity material RKO, Pioneer, and Technicolor were looking for.
Lord, stay in heaven me appointed to...
With one successful Technicolor short on their hands, Pioneer was ready to press forward with a feature. Initial trade announcements in the summer of 1934 indicated that an adaptation of Dumas's The Three Musketeers, featuring Francis Lederer and an all-star cast, but by July show that the production company had settled on Becky Sharp. Pioneer never produced The Three Musketeers, and instead the project went to Roland V. Lee, and the Lederer role went to Ian Keith.
How would they take to me?
Others thrown around during this time were The Last Days of Pompeii and Green Mansions, the latter of which was to star Dolores Del Rio and Joel McCrea, re-teaming the duo after their success in Bird of Paradise in 1932.
Club, eh?
Over the summer of 1934, negotiations with Miriam Hopkins for the lead role were pursued, but RKO and the actress couldn't come to an agreement on a price. By August, trade magazines were reporting that Hopkins was out, and Myrna Loy, who had played the same role just 2 years previous, would be Pioneer's Becky. How far Loy was actually considered, we may never know. But also mentioned was Claudette Colbert, who at that point was freelancing after her Paramount contract, and who reportedly considered the part until she read the script and turned it down. It's not clear as to whether or not these offers were serious, but they were enough to make Hopkins come to some agreement with RKO. By the end of September, it was official that she would have the lead in the new Technicolor feature. Whitney set up the new Pioneer offices in the Grand Central Terminal building in New York City. Flying back and forth between New York and Hollywood, Whitney reportedly made 48 flights during pre-production. On November 2nd, Whitney made his plans public and announced that he would be spending a minimum of $7 million over the course of 9 or more Technicolor features through RKO. And once the two-picture deal signed with the studio had been completed, Marion C. Cooper would join Pioneer and serve as vice president of that company. With Robert Edmund Jones ready to art direct the film, and Kenneth McGowan serving as general producer, Pioneer and RKO turned to director Lowell Sherman in October to helm the film's dramatic direction. A San Francisco native, Sherman was originally a stage actor who had worked with David Belasco. Sherman started his Hollywood career in 1914 opposite Mary Pickford in Behind the Scenes. A handsome leading man, he continued to work with high-profile films throughout the 1920s, most notably in D.W. Griffith's Way Down East in 1920, and against Greta Garbo in 1928's The Divine Woman for MGM. Sherman began directing during the sound transition, his first feature being Lawful Larceny for RKO in 1930. His specialty were society comedies and dramas, but his most famous directorial effort is 1933's She Done Him Wrong, the picture in which Mae West famously quips, "Why don't you come up sometime and see me?" Technicolor sent Ray Renahan to RKO to sit behind the camera. Renahan was one of the great cinematographers of the studio system who worked almost exclusively in Technicolor. Born in 1896 in Las Vegas, Nevada, Renahan moved to Los Angeles at the age of 21, where he began his association with the Technicolor Corporation. Renahan was there with Kalmus in the early Ugly days when he cranked cameras for lowly one-reel comedies and continued with the company all the way up to this moment. Renahan had shot for von Sternberg on The Wedding March, photographed The Gold Diggers of Broadway and The King of Jazz for Universal, Whoopi for Goldwyn, and Dr. X and the Mystery of the Wax Museum for Warner Brothers. He already tested out the 3-strip rig on the color segments for The Cat and the Fiddle and Kid Millions, as well as half a dozen shorts for Warner Brothers. After La Cucaracha, Renahan was ready to photograph Becky Sharp. After the film's production, Renahan continued to be synonymous with Technicolor and lensed such epics as Kentucky, Drums Along the Mohawk, Blood and Sand, and Duel in the Sun. During production of Gone with the Wind, Renahan oversaw operation of the 3-strip camera. With a career that spanned over 50 years, Renahan spent the second half working on the small screen and was the director of photography on countless TV shows and TV movies. One of his last credits was the TV movie pilot of the popular NBC TV movie series Columbo in Prescription Murder in 1969. His final credit was the TV movie version of I Love a Mystery, an Ida Lupino NBC show that had been shot in 1966 and shelved until 1973. Renahan effectively retired from work in 1969 at the age of 73, and passed away at his home in Tarzana, California in 1980. Throughout November, costumes, sets, and makeup were tested. Makeup manufacturer and specialist Max Factor was brought in to specially formulate makeups that would photograph the best in the new Technicolor. Although there is no credit for costume design in this film, it's believed that Jones brought in his own consultants who designed them to his specifications. Set construction was overseen by Ward Einan, himself a veteran set decorator and art director going back to the teens. With the cast and personnel set, rehearsals finished, and costume and set tests photographed and greenlit, Technicolor's cameras began rolling at or around December 16, 1934. Around the same time, rumors circulated that producer David O. Selznick, now finishing his contract at MGM, would be joining Whitney at Pioneer. MGM head Nicholas Schenck denied it. Quote, "Metro has not lost an executive since I've been president. We like him, and he likes us. He can be with us as long as his association is mutually satisfactory." Then, tragedy struck the production. Director Lowell Sherman began to become lethargic on set, but despite his illness continued to press on with the production. On December 28, 1934, less than 2 weeks into the production, Lowell Sherman died of pneumonia. The production, and Hollywood at large, were in a state of shock. The Whitneys scrambled to find a replacement for Sherman. The production was put on hold for 2 weeks, at which time Elsie Ferguson, who was playing the role of the Duchess of Richmond, also became ill and had to leave the production. She was replaced by Doris Lloyd. Sherman's wife, Pauline Guerin, was given a small role in the film as Fifine after her husband died. Sherman's replacement turned out to be kismet for the production. Director Ruben Mamoulian had only 7 Hollywood films under his belt, but they were all winners. Born in pre-Soviet Georgia in 1897, Mamoulian studied in Paris and at the University of Moscow, where he studied law. In his spare time, he studied theater at the Moscow Art Theater under the Russian-Armenian Yevgeny Vatangov, who himself was a student of Konstantin Stanislavski. In 1918, Mamoulian toured England with the Russian Repertory Theater. He stayed in Britain and directed several plays there, leading to a 3-year tenure at the George Eastman Theater in Rochester, New York, as the director of operas and operettas. He began teaching theater and directing plays for the Theater Guild in 1926, and in 1927 gained acclaim for his direction of Dorothy and DuBose Hayward's Porgy, which ran on Broadway for just over a year. The success of this show would later lead to Mamoulian directing the musical version of the story by George and Ira Gershwin, Porgy and Bess. Paramount Pictures soon came knocking at Mamoulian's door, just as the transition to sound was wreaking technical and artistic havoc in the industry. With Sound Pictures taken over, the fluidity and ingenuity of direction had come to practically a standstill. Cameras were now locked down in soundproof booths, practically unable to get the dynamic angles that had epitomized the silent screen. With his first picture, Applause, shot at Paramount's Astoria Studios in New York, Mamoulian broke all these boundaries and showed the dynamic cinematography that was still possible with a little clever camera work and editing. The success of this film led him to Hollywood in 1931, where he directed the equally fluid City Streets with Gary Cooper and Sylvia Sidney. That same year, he directed the first sound version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Frederick March. It was during this film that he first worked with Becky Sharp's star, Miriam Hopkins. He followed this with 2 of his most artistic productions, Love Me Tonight with Maurice Chevalier and The Song of Songs with Marlene Dietrich. Now an independent producer, Mamoulian had carte blanche of Hollywood and produced Queen Christina for Metro, reuniting the inimitable romance teaming of Greta Garbo and John Gilbert. This was followed by a Russian drama for Goldwyn, We Live Again, with Anna Sten and Frederick March. Mamoulian scrapped all of Sherman's footage and started from square one. With the cast and crew reorganized, Becky Sharp began filming at RKO on January 15, 1935. While Mamoulian worked closely with Robert Edmond Jones on the color design, one person in particular plagued the production. That person was Natalie Kalmus. Originally Natalie Dunphy, she was born in Maine in 1882. At the age of 19, she married Herbert Kalmus in 1902, while they were both students. Divorced from Kalmus officially in 1921, The two continued to live together in the same house until 1944. Despite whatever behind-the-scenes drama may have been going on at the Kalmuses' house, Natalie was front and center at the Technicolor Corporation as their head color consultant. A former art student, Kalmus was incredibly outspoken about the use of color in the productions, and often overreached her authority about how color should be used in productions rather than how costumes and sets would appear printed in Technicolor. This attitude often alienated her from producers and directors who thought of her as kind of a crackpot. So did Mamoulian. After a short time working with her on the set, Mamoulian reportedly stormed off of it. "Look, tomorrow either she is not there or I am not there." Kalmus quietly disappeared into the background for the rest of the shoot. Mamoulian, who had previously eschewed color photography, now sung its praise, but cautioned that the psychological impact of color in film must be controlled. Quote, "There is no middle ground in the use of color, and it either helps or mars a scene," he stated. In using color, one must be aware that each color produces a definite reaction, and that color employed must reflect the mood or feeling of the scene being shot. Color contrasts must also be considered as, for example, in filming a scene which mounts to an exciting climax, the color must follow the rising tempo of the action. Filming wrapped March 20th. By the end of production, it was estimated that Pioneer had spent about $950,000 on the film. Editing the film was left to RKO's Archie Marshak, who had previously edited La Cucaracha for Pioneer. Marshak, a Minnesota native, originally worked for Joe Kennedy's FBO, the studio that in 1929 merged with the Keith Orpheum Theater Circuit to create RKO. Kennedy was responsible for editing many of RKO's early successes, including Danger Lights, Bird of Paradise, The Most Dangerous Game, and The Phantom of Crestwood. After leaving RKO in the mid-30s, Marshak moved to Paramount Pictures, where he would continue editing high-profile, snappy-paced films, such as the Bob Hope Cat and the Canary in 1939, The Glass Key in 1942, and A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court in 1949. In later years at Paramount, Marshak edited for the Pine Thomas unit, where he edited some of the first VistaVision films. He also edited a number of Martin and Lewis and Elvis films. His last credit was Shootout with Gregory Peck in 1971. He retired to the Midwest, where he passed away in 1992. It should be pointed out that the technical requirements of editing a 3-strip Technicolor show were incredibly grueling. Basic cutting was done on a black and white work print generated from the green record. But once each reel was completed, editing had to be conformed to the red, green, and blue records of the film. Any transitions, such as fades, dissolves, wipes, or any optical special effects, had to be done in an optical printer 3 times, and carefully cut into the original camera negative to maintain synchronization. Any loss of synchronization would result in a smeary mess of color on the screen. During previews, an audio issue arose. Preview audiences complained of a pumping noise in the dialogue in the soundtrack. The film had been recorded using RKO's contracted sound equipment from RCA. Sound department head James G. Stewart felt that the system was apt to picking up certain words and sibilances too clearly, making other words sound muddled at the standard playback level in theaters. RKO and RCA rushed for a solution and re-recorded the track on the competing Western Electric equipment with a compressor. The end result was not good, but it was passable.
How the devil did you ever catch my fancy? Because there isn't an ounce of
With the film completed, the publicity machine took over. RKO was set to premiere the film at the 6,000-seat Radio City Music Hall in New York in June. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Edmund Jones threw a gala Becky Sharp cocktail party at the Waldorf Astoria on May 15th, no doubt banked by Mr. Whitney. The Motion Picture Club in Hollywood set up a color forum on May 28th. Attendance included Kalmus and his associates, Whitney, Jones, Mamoulian, Miriam Hopkins, Billy Burke, Gene Raymond, and Louis Nizer as Toastmaster. Kalmus made opening remarks, quote, "I predict there will soon be Disneys in the feature field. A few outstanding successful features will be produced in color, proving for the feature field what Disney proved for cartoons, and color will begin to sweep the industry as obviously sooner or later it must." Jones returned to New York in May to set up for the premiere of Becky Sharp at Radio City Music Hall and do the obligatory interview circuit, where he made the bold statement that it was his opinion that the industry would be shooting entirely in color within a few months. Quote, "A cameraman can have the entire film production under his control, for with color films there can be no conflict of authority," Jones bragged to the Film Daily. In a June 1935 issue of Vanity Fair, a publication Jones frequently penned for, he published the article A Revolution in Movies, likening the difference between black and white and color films to a stage play and grand opera. Quote, "A marvelous new instrument is given to us," Jones wrote, "by means of which we may combine the beauty of painting and the emotional flow of music. This instrument must be played upon." At the Technicolor plant in Hollywood, printers worked around the clock to fill the print order for RKO's release. 259 prints were made for the U.S., and 189 prints were made for overseas distribution, totaling 448 prints. Ever the philanthropist, in early June 1935, Whitney set up as part of a grant through the Rockefeller Foundation the first program in the country to preserve motion pictures. A $100,000 grant was given to the Museum of Modern Art. Iris Berry was put in charge of curation, and the establishment of one of the country's most venerable archives was born. Finally, the big day had arrived. On June 13, 1935, Becky Sharp premiered at Radio City Music Hall in New York. Robert Edmond Jones, producing his annual opera in Central City, Colorado, flew in and out especially for the event. It was possibly the highest brow of premieres, a party thrown by Jock Whitney himself. Present for the premiere were Daniel Frohman, Billy Burke, Charles MacArthur, Helen Hayes, Anna Sten, director Mamoulian, Helen Wesley, Tallulah Bankhead, Walter Pidgeon, Sylvia Sidney, Loretta Young, Irving Berlin, Gene Tunney, Ed Sullivan, James Farley, William Gaxton, Tullio Carminati, Adolf Zucker, and Mr. and Mrs. James Roosevelt. The next day, the reviews came in. They were ambivalent. The New York Times' Andre Senwald covered the premiere. Quote, "Both incredibly disappointing and incredibly thrilling," he wrote, criticizing the story as, quote, "dramatically tedious and endlessly talk table as well." Although he noted about the color, quote, "much more significant was an experiment in the advance of color than a straightforward dramatic entertainment." But Senwald also added, "Its best is so good that it becomes a prophecy of the future of color on the screen. It forced this column to the conclusion that color will become an integral motion picture element in the next few years." Thornton Delahanty of the New York Post praised the new Technicolor arrival. Quote, "The death knell of black and white films sounded yesterday with the arrival and glorious raiment of Becky Sharp. Even without color, it would be a superior picture in the naturalistic hues with which the improved Technicolor has invested in it. Becky Sharp becomes more than a photoplay. It is an exciting adventure in the new medium, a finger pointing dramatically toward hitherto unrealized possibilities in motion picture art." Murray Boltinoff of the New York American also praised the film's color milestone, stating, quote, "This department contributes its vote to the assured success of Becky Sharp. Further, it predicts that it will be henceforth as important to the cinema as the jazz singer. It is brisk and lively, sensitive and serene, and what excitement there is exudes naturally from the story." 4 days later, RKO opened the film at the Palace Theater in Chicago during their annual convention in that town. Whitney and Mamoulian both greeted exhibitors and held a brunch with details of Pioneer's future plans in color picture making. By the end of June, the film had opened in Boston, Washington, Syracuse, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Rochester, Albany, Buffalo, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. But by the end of its first month, it was clear. Despite strong openings in metropolitan areas, Becky Sharp was by no means a success at the box office. Official estimates put the domestic gross of the film at $672,000. Although hardly an artistic failure, as proof of concept, it was what Whitney needed to convince backers that shooting a feature in the new Technicolor was even feasible. Pioneer pressed on. The following year, they produced The Dancing Pirate with Charles Collins, Steffi Duna from La Cucaracha, and Frank Morgan, who many of you will remember from The Wizard of Oz. This film, as well as the Walter Wanger production of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine, showed more economic uses of 3-strip Technicolor in feature-length productions. Following David O. Selznick's retirement from MGM, Whitney bankrolled his business plan in 1935 to form Selznick International Pictures. The following year, Whitney's company and Selznick merged. In 1937, Pioneer Pictures produced the Janet Gaynor and Frederick March dramatic film in Technicolor, A Star is Born. The following year, Pioneer Pictures produced the final film under that banner, Nothing Sacred, with Carole Lombard and Frederick March in Technicolor. In July 1943, as previously mentioned, Whitney, Cooper, and Selznick sold their rights to the productions to Film Classics Incorporated for worldwide distribution. In 1963, the receiver of these films neglected to renew the copyright on them, entering all of Pioneer's films into the public domain. In 2017, Paramount Studios, who had acquired the rights to NTA's holdings, took it upon themselves to update GIT and UCLA's restorations into the digital age. Using UCLA's 1984, 1988, and 2002 update restorations as the framework, the entire film was rescanned at 4K resolution and once again restored. Since the GIT restoration, more elements had turned up. A complete but subtitled Dutch print filled in the missing elements to this last reel, which is why when you watch this, the quality jumps back and forth. All elements were scanned at Technicolor at 4K resolution, with the goal of doing the entire restoration in 4K when possible. The following are quotations of notes from the restoration report by Nikki G. about the restoration as it occurred at Paramount. Some important reels to note are reels 4, 5, 7, and 9. Reel 4 contains the famous Napoleon attack sequence featuring the ballrooms filled with colorful dresses that use the entire Technicolor spectrum, but unfortunately was missing the yellow separation to showcase it. So for that reel, and with the guidance of Bob Gitt and his collaborators, Richard Dayton and Eric Ajala, who sat in on a few sessions, we judiciously used some of the Dutch print for some of the shots to give us an idea of what the scene looked like. Tests include making our own artificial record by using the magenta record twice, once as a yellow record like Bob did in his restoration. The results turned out really well. Reel 5 had no green record. After doing similar tests as Reel 4, we came up with something that looked pretty good. We scanned the Dutch print, but Technicolor said it was a different version and didn't have all the footage we needed, so we didn't move forward with that. Reel 7 was the only reel to have the entirety of the original YCM negatives. Reel 9 was missing both a real blue and green record, so one of the tests we tried was to extract the missing records from the Dutch Technicolor print. The results didn't look too good, so we ended up using the separations Bob Gitt made.
Happening for years. What I mean to say is
We ended up using as much of the Dutch print as we could for this reel, and are instead filling in the jump cuts and subtitled areas with our recombine. In the future, there may be a way to edit out the subtitles to feature more 35mm 3-color. We were able to recombine the end credits as 35mm YCM negatives, though, as the original film was found still attached to the tail of the magenta seps. Once everything was assembled, which included leaving in UCLA's title card at the head, a sync proxy was sent over to Chase Audio. We did not have access to the original soundtrack negatives, but we did have access to the preservation negatives that UCLA had made, as well as 2 sets of magnetic tracks that had been made during the initial preservation, and an extended version that matched the new length once the Dutch print was found. We evaluated them against the preservation 3-track mags, and the mag was chosen to be our primary element and was transferred. Becky Sharp is now digitally preserved at its highest and best looking and sounding quality possible within the scope of this preservation project.
You have no need of him now. No, I can go with you.
A coda to this commentary, and perhaps a morbid one, in Thackeray's original novel, we're led to believe that although Becky marries Sedley, his ending is anything but happily ever after, and she spends her last days as a premature widow. Fortunately for us, this film has not met the same demise.
You've decided to come up after all.
At this time, I'd like to give special thanks to a number of fine people who have made this commentary possible. Many thanks to Laura Thornburg and Nikki G at Paramount Pictures for their time and effort in getting to me as much information about the digital restoration of this film as possible. David Pierce and James Layton for their ongoing research and helpful groundwork that made describing the history of Technicolor possible here. I highly recommend their book, The Dawn of Technicolor, if you're interested in learning more about the process and the film shot in it. My gratitude to Bob Fermanek for pulling up several documents I didn't have access to, and special thanks to the Media History Digital Library for all the effort they put into making trade magazines and other historical documents available for researchers such as myself. If you haven't checked them out, please take a moment to visit mediahist.org. This has been Jack Theakston, and it has been my pleasure speaking to you about Becky Sharp, A Pioneer Picture.
You're in love with the man. You can't live without him. It would break your heart to lose him. Emmy, I'm not coming home with you. I'll not let you do this. I'll send you back to Dobbin, no matter how much he's hated me. Don't give up, love. Don't let it be taken from you by me or anybody else. Fight for it. Keep it. It doesn't come often. But you... Don't worry about me. I'll manage. Go downstairs. He'll be waiting for you. Take his hand. Ask him to marry you.
God, I'll never marry him.
You will? Why shouldn't you?
Because of George. I must be true to his memory, his love.
Love? Why, you fool, you monkey. He never really loved you.
He did.
I'll prove it to you.
No matter what you say, you'll think he did.
Oh, he was never faithful to you. He made love to me, but you were hardly married to him. Your husband in heaven. Oh, here it is. You know the handwriting. He wrote this to me, sent it to me in Brussels, right under your unsuspecting little nose. Now you know. Now you're free to forget the past. Go to the man who really loves you. Marry him. Go on, go on.
I say, Emmy, did you and Dobbin have a breeze?
Just you're drunk.
Drunk? I drunk. This is an injustice. Am I her only brother? Similarly, is she my only sister? Similarly, where is she running to?
To Dobbin. She's going to marry him.
Huh? Well, I think that's beautiful.
Well, what's the matter with you? What have you lost?
Lost my heart out of my bosom to see my sister blessed with such happiness.
Why weep? They'll be happy, but they haven't stolen all the happiness in the world.
I think they have.
Would you like to sit down and be just as happy as they are?
Yes.
Do you like brandy, Joseph?
Well, how would it sit with a beer in there?
Perfect. Extra fine cognac. And we have biscuits and gorgonzola. We'll have a little feast. Do you mind sharing the plate with me?
No, quite the contrary. I'll even share the bottle.
Have only one knife. I'm ashamed to admit. Isn't it enchanting?
Enchanting. You're enchanting, too.
Drink hearty, drink deep. 1,000,000 years have passed since we drank together. Or sat together undisturbed, returning glance for glance, smile for smile.
Gorgonzola for gorgonzola.
To the happy two people, to the memory of the past, and the joy of the present, when two people meet again and they agree.
That's it. Agree. I honor the sentiment, Becky.
To pitch their little tent or little cottage with the trees and the stars above.
I honor the stars above.
And the murmuring of moonlit streams and the perfume of flowers. Does that fetch you, you dear gay fellow?
It's you that are gay, Becky. Gay and gallant. Come closer, Becky.
Oh, Joss, you frighten me. You're so intense.
Intense, but honorable, Becky. Tell me, are you a widow? Yes or no, because you must become my widow next.
Later we'll talk about it. Now you must help me pack. I've had enough of all this. We're going.
Going? Where?
Mayfair, India, anywhere. Away from all this.
But we can't, Becky. I have no money.
No money? You're poor?
Who dares accuse Joseph Waterloo Sedley of poverty? No, it's just that I have no cash. We'll have to wait here for a week until my next month's allowance comes.
But I can't wait. The landlord will have me jailed by then. Speak of the devil. Who's there?
It's I, Rebecca, and Jane.
There. My letter, they've come. Oh, what shall I do?
Let me throw them out.
Wait. Perhaps they're a blessing in disguise. Vicky?
Sister.
Brother! The money we need. I'll get it from Pitt. Oh, darling Jane, I can't believe it's really you. One moment, I must make myself presentable. Quick, climb out of the window. If Pitt finds you here, I'll never get the money from him. Climb out.
I can't. The cheese has gone to my head.
I'm almost ready, quite ready. There. Hurry. Oh, this bliss, this happiness. Oh, Jane, my Jane, my forgiving kinsman, to see you again, to feel my hand in yours after such a long time.
Your letter came, Rebecca. Our hearts were deeply touched by your plight.
My prayers have been answered.
Yes, we've come to rescue you.
To restore you to the bosom of our family, to the tranquility of Queen's Crawley.
Queen's Crawley. Oh, I'm overcome.
But before we do that, my dear, you must cleanse your soul.
Ah.
Rebecca, would it not make you happy to go to church with us before we talk of anything else?
Oh, I'd go happily. As soon as I settle with the landlord, he'll not let me leave the house until I pay the money I owe him.
Isn't the peace of your soul more urgent?
Yes, but so is the landlord. Urgent.
I trust it's not a large amount.
Oh, no. 200 pounds.
Settle with him for 35.
150.
50 then.
Make it 100, brother. Then we can go and listen to the sermon.
Oh.
Thank you.
What was that? Aren't you alone?
Alone, always alone. It must have been a mouse.
And now, dear, get your bonnet and come to regain peace.
Yes, regain. Peace. Oh, peace. Regain. Bonnet.
Oh, what's wrong? Are you ill?
My heart. The excitement of seeing you again.
Some water.
Oh, no. Perhaps I'll feel better soon if I rested.
Yes, rest. And I shall stay with you and care for you in your need.
Oh, no, you mustn't. I'd never forgive myself if you missed the service. You must go, dear. I'm used to my solitude. Please go and come back for me later.
Come, dear, Rebecca's overwrought. Soon she'll be better. This book of moral precepts which we brought you. When you're better, read and profit. The title is Rewards of Virtue.
Until later, then, poor child. Rest well.
£100, and I owe the landlord 12. Don't stand there blinking at me. We must get out of here.
I'm not blinking. That's love.
The trunk before love. Put those letters in the locket. We're going. India. Rich princes. Taxes to collect.
Butterflies and elephants.
And Rogers and rubies and gold. The book. Oh, Pitt, brother.
Yes, Rebecca?
My deepest gratitude, brother, but virtue is its own reward.